I needed a break. The city had worn me down, and the stress of life was crushing. So, when my friend suggested a weekend getaway to a remote cabin in the woods, it felt like the perfect escape. No Wi-Fi, no phones, just nature, silence, and maybe a few drinks by the fire. The drive took us deep into the woods, far away from any trace of civilization. It was a charming cabin, small but cozy, with a wide wooden porch that overlooked the dense forest. We joked about how isolated we were, the perfect spot for a horror movie. My friend Sarah had said, laughing. In hindsight, it wasn't a joke. We unpacked quickly, eager to start our retreat. There were 4 of us: Sarah, her boyfriend Mark, our friend Jake, and me. The first evening was peaceful. We made dinner, drank wine, and watched the stars above. The air was so fresh, and the quiet of the woods was almost too perfect. I remember thinking how this was exactly what I needed. That night, I was the first to head to bed. The wine had made me drowsy, and I craved sleep. The others stayed up, talking and laughing late into the night. As I drifted off, I heard the faint sound of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, a gentle lullaby that carried me into slumber. But then something woke me. I wasn't sure what at first. I sat up, groggy, listening. It was quiet, too quiet. The crickets had stopped. It was that kind of silence that feels wrong, like the air itself is holding its breath. And then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic creak, like footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I strained my ears, listening harder. Sarah, Mark, I called out. But no one responded. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer had wandered close, or it was the wind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I mentioned the footsteps to Sarah as we made breakfast. She laughed it off, saying it was probably an animal, or maybe one of the guys playing a prank. Mark nodded in agreement, but Jake was quiet, his face serious. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he said slowly. "There's no one out here but us." That day, we hiked through the woods, enjoying the crisp air and the thrill of being disconnected from the world. Everything felt normal again. And by the time we returned to the cabin, I had almost forgotten about the footsteps. Almost. That night, it happened again. I had just fallen asleep when I heard it creak, creak, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. This time, I was wide awake. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, too scared to move. The steps were slow, heavy, like someone or something was circling the cabin. Inspecting it, I heard the soft sound of scratching on the walls, a low scraping that sent chills down my spine. Summoning all the courage I could, I crept out of bed and peered through the window. The porch was empty, but the sound, it was still there. I checked the others. Jake was asleep, and so were Sarah and Mark. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, I showed them the scratch marks. They ran along the side of the cabin, long and jagged, too high up for any animal to have made. Sarah's face turned pale, and for the first time, Mark didn't have a joke ready. Jake just stared at the marks, his jaw tight. "Maybe it's the wind," Sarah suggested weakly, but we all knew better. That night, none of us wanted to be the first to go to bed. We stayed up late, sitting by the fire, trying to laugh off the unease that had settled over us. But eventually, fatigue won. One by one, we retreated to our rooms. The moment I lay down, I heard it, the footsteps. Only this time, they weren't just on the porch. They were inside the cabin. My blood turned cold. I held my breath, hoping, praying that I was imagining it. But no, the sound was real, and it was getting closer. It stopped just outside my door. I could feel it, whatever it was. It was right there on the other side, just waiting. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my throat. Slowly, I reached for the door handle, shaking uncontrollably. I had to see what it was, but before I could, Sarah screamed from the other room. The sound of her voice broke the silence like a shattering glass. I bolted out of bed, racing to her door. Mark and Jake were already there. Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, trembling, pointing at the window. I saw someone," she whispered, "standing there, just watching me." We searched the entire cabin, inside and out, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of anyone or anything. But the marks on the walls had gotten worse. Deep gouges ran along the outside, circling the cabin as if something had been clawing to get in. None of us slept that night. At first light, we packed our things and left. The sense of relief as we drove away was overwhelming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us leave. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had a dark history. Decades ago, a man had lived there with his family. One winter, they all disappeared without a trace. Locals claimed the man went mad, that he killed them and buried their bodies in the woods. Others said it wasn't him. It was something in the forest that took them. I don't know what I believe anymore, but I do know one thing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. And it's still there, waiting for the next group of people who think they're just getting away from it all. The next time someone invites you to a cabin in the woods, maybe you should say no. We all crave escape from time to time, and when my girlfriend Rachel suggested a weekend getaway at her family's old cabin, I agreed without hesitation. Nestled deep in the woods, far from the chaos of the city, it seemed like the perfect place to unwind. She had been there many times as a child, but this would be my first visit. The drive took longer than expected, and by the time we arrived, the sun was already setting behind the trees. The cabin stood alone in a small clearing, its dark wooden walls weathered by years of harsh winters. Despite its rustic appearance, it had a strange charm. Rachel unlocked the front door with a rusty key, and we stepped inside. The interior was cozy, though it had the unmistakable scent of old wood and dust. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with an old-fashioned kitchen off to the side. The light was dim, even with the lamps on, casting long shadows that seemed to creep along the walls. As I dropped our bags by the couch, I noticed something odd right away. There was a door in the far corner of the cabin, next to the kitchen. Unlike the other doors, it had a large iron padlock securing it. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to the locked door. Rachel glanced at it and shrugged. "That door's always been locked. My family never used it. I don't even know where it leads." "Never used it? You've been coming here for years and you've never opened it?" She shook her head, unconcerned. "Nope, it's just always been like that. My dad said it was probably an old storage room or something." I frowned. Curiosity piqued, but Rachel seemed eager to forget about it. We spent the evening outside by the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and drinking wine under the stars. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. But that night, something changed. I was jolted awake by a loud thud coming from inside the cabin. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. Another thud, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. It was coming from the kitchen area, from the direction of the locked door. "Rachel," I whispered, shaking her awake. "Did you hear that?" She groaned, still half asleep. "It's probably just the wind. Jake, go back to sleep." But it wasn't the wind. The noise was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept out of bed, careful not to make any noise. My pulse pounded in my ears as I made my way into the living room. The sound was louder now, scratching, like something was trying to claw its way out. I stood frozen, staring at the locked door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I reached out, my hand shaking, and touched the padlock. It was ice cold. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. I waited. Flashlight pointed at the door, but nothing happened. Slowly, I backed away. Returning to bed, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told Rachel about the sounds, but she just laughed it off. This place is old, Jake. It creaks and groans. You're just not used to it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The door, the noises, there was something behind it, and it wadded out. As the day went on, I became more obsessed with the door. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes kept drifting to that corner of the cabin, wondering what lay behind it. Rachel suggested we go for a hike to clear my mind, but even in the woods, I couldn't stop thinking about it. When we returned, I made a decision. I'm going to open it. Rachel stared at me like I had lost my mind. What? No, Jake. It's locked for a reason. Let's just leave it alone. But I couldn't. Something deep inside me needed to know. I grabbed the toolkit from the car and started working on the padlock. It was old and rusty, and after a few minutes of prying, it finally snapped open with a metallic clink. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. A cold draft hit me, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. Rachel stood behind me, her face pale. Jake, I don't think this is a good idea. I hesitated, but the pull was too strong. I had to see. I grabbed the flashlight and descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder the further I went, and the smell of rot grew stronger. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam of my flashlight illuminated a small stone room. It was empty, save for a few old crates and something in the corner. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer. Lying in the corner, half buried in the dirt, was a small, weathered doll. Its eyes were missing, and its clothes were rotted and torn. I knelt down, reaching out to touch it, when the scratching started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from beneath the floor. I jumped back, heart racing. The sound grew louder, more frantic, like something was clawing its way up from the earth. I looked at the ground beneath me, horrified, as the dirt began to shift and move. Something was beneath the surface, something trying to break free. Jake, Rachel screamed from the top of the stairs. Get out of there. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. The scratching stopped, but the dread remained. We packed our things in a frenzy, neither of us speaking. The cabin, once peaceful, now felt oppressive, as if the very walls were watching us. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood silent in the fading light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that door, it wasn't finished. The scratching still echoed in my mind. We never spoke of that weekend again. A few months later, I heard Rachel's family had sold the cabin. I didn't ask why, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, the scratching, and I wonder if I had stayed just a little longer, what would have come through. It was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Rachel and I had been planning a getaway for weeks. No distractions, no phones, just nature. Her family's cabin was perfect for that. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from any other human contact. The drive was long, and by the time we reached the cabin, the sun had dipped low behind the treetops, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The cabin itself was small but cozy, made of dark wood and stone, with a small porch overlooking the dense forest. Inside, it was rustic old furniture, a fireplace, and a thick layer of dust on every surface. Rachel flicked on the lights, and the faint glow made the place feel more lived in. I threw our bags down and headed for the kitchen, my mind already on the dinner we had packed. Jake, Rachel called from the living room, her voice uneasy. Come check this out. I walked over and found her standing near the back wall, staring at something strange, a framed photograph. It was old, black and white, depicting a group of people, maybe 6 or 7, standing in front of the cabin. They looked like hikers, each one holding a walking stick, smiling at the camera, but one figure, standing off to the side, caught my attention. A man, tall and gaunt, wearing a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat, his face barely visible in the shadows. "What's so weird about it?" I asked, squinting at the picture. "Look at the date." Rachel pointed to the bottom of the frame. Carved into the wood was the year, 1947. That's old. But so what? People have been hiking up here for decades. No, Jake, it's not that. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. "I swear I've seen this guy before, the one in the hat. I remember seeing someone like him the last time I was up here as a kid." I laughed, shaking my head. "Come on, Rach. It's just an old photo." But she didn't laugh. Her eyes stayed locked on the man in the hat. We pushed it out of our minds as best we could and went on with our evening. The night fell fast. The forest surrounding the cabin growing darker and eerily quiet. I stepped out on the porch for some air while Rachel went to bed early. The sky was pitch black, the only light coming from the sliver of the moon. I could barely make out the tree line in the distance. That's when I saw it, a flash of movement, just at the edge of the woods. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained my eyes, trying to catch another glimpse. For a moment, I saw nothing, and I wondered if I just imagined it. But then, there it was again, a figure standing between the trees, the man in the hat. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at him, frozen. He was far away, but there was no mistaking it. The same wide-brimmed hat, the same lanky frame, just standing there, watching. "Rachel," I shouted, backing into the cabin. "Rachel, come here." She rushed out of the bedroom, startled. "What's wrong?" "There's someone outside at the edge of the woods." My voice was shaking. "I think it's him." She didn't ask who. I could tell by the look in her eyes that she knew exactly what I was talking about. Without a word, she grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trail line with the beam. But the man was gone. The forest was still, and the only sound was the distant chirping of crickets. "I don't see anyone," Rachel said, her voice trembling now. "Are you sure you saw him?" "I swear I did." My mind raced as I replayed the image over and over. He was just standing there, staring at the cabin. We locked the doors that night, every window latched tight, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting back to that photograph, the man in the hat, and the unease in Rachel's voice. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps. Just outside the cabin, my heart pounded in my chest as I sat up in bed, listening. The footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin, crunching in the gravel outside. Rachel was still asleep beside me, but I didn't dare move. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, right outside our bedroom window. I held my breath, afraid to even blink. The faintest tap, tap, tap echoed against the glass. Someone was there, right outside, tapping on the window. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and threw open the curtains. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but no one was there, just the empty, black forest staring back at me. "What the hell?" I whispered, stepping back, my mind spinning. Rachel stirred awake, groggy and confused. "Jake, what's going on?" "Someone's outside." I heard footsteps. She bolted upright, the fear returning to her face. "We need to get out of here." We threw on our clothes in a hurry and grabbed our keys. The cabin, once a place of solace, now felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. We rushed to the front door, but when I turned the knob it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck. No, I muttered, yanking harder. It was as if something was holding it shut. "Jake, try the windows," Rachel shouted, panic rising in her voice. I rushed to the nearest window, but it wouldn't open either. We were trapped. Every door, every window was sealed shut. It didn't make sense. Then we heard it, the footsteps again. This time, they were inside the cabin. They started slowly, pacing back and forth across the wooden floor. My heart raced, and Rachel clutched my arm. The air in the room seemed to thicken, a cold draft chilling my skin. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. And then I saw him. The man in the hat stood at the far end of the living room, his face obscured by the shadow of his wide brim. His body was gaunt, clothes tattered, just like in the photograph. But his eyes, they were hollow, black voids, staring right through me. "Get away from us," I screamed, grabbing a chair and throwing it toward him. It sailed through the air, but when it hit him, he disappeared, just gone. The door suddenly creaked open behind us. "Go," I shouted, pulling Rachel outside. We ran to the car, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and we sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the man behind. We never went back. A week later, we found out the cabin had burned down, leaving nothing but ashes. No one could explain how the fire started, but I knew the last hiker, he never left.